Thank you for tuning in to today's Community Science Quick Take on responses to the impact of COVID-19 among Latinx communities. The media has been covering how Latinx communities are disproportionately affected by the health and economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, little attention is given to how Latinx communities across the country are coming together to address the health, economic, and social justice issues they face. In this quick take, we will explore these issues through the perspectives of three individuals working with Latinx communities from different fields. They will discuss how they draw from community strengths to meet immediate needs during this crisis. They will also share lessons learned from their work during the pandemic that can be applied to future efforts to advance equity and justice for these communities. Our three contributors are Liana Montesinos, Immigration Attorney and Executive Director of United for Social Justice, Alina Thouyaret, Strategic Advisor and Instructional Coach at DC Bilingual Public Charter School, and Erika V, Program Officer at the Grand Rapids Community Foundation and Communications Coordinator for the Latino Community Coalition.
Liana, how has the COVID-19 crisis affected the Latinx communities that UNTItled Chapter and United for Social Justice serve?
I believe that the Latinx community has been particularly severely impacted at a higher rate than other communities. Most of our members of the community work in the service industry, work in the farms, work in construction, really the workplaces that have been labeled as essential places for our society to continue functioning. And because of that, and because of the factor of finances, the inability of them to say, oh, I will take a week off from work, or I will stop working until the pandemic is over. They have to be in the front lines of this pandemic. And so what that means is that our community is more likely to get infected by the virus and to become sick, and for their family members to go through additional hardships because they must be in the front lines due to what they do in our society and also their financial status in our society.
Alina, can you tell us about how the COVID-19 crisis has affected the families and students that you work with as part of DC Bilingual Public Charter School?
Many families have lost loved ones. Also, they're experiencing financial constraints. Many Latinx parents work in the food industry, and COVID impacted that industry harshly. And in terms of the school, we were forced to close our building and transition to an only virtual environment. And our school is just more than just a place to learn. Our students spend most of their day in our building. They have breakfast, they have lunch, they have healthy snacks, and they receive a lot of social emotional support. And for many of them, they also receive services, additional services. And so as you can imagine, it's been a huge impact for our students and our families.
So Erika, how has the COVID-19 crisis affected the communities that you work with through the Grand Rapids Community Foundation and the Latino Community Coalition?
When the COVID numbers here in Kent County began to peak in April and May, 43% at its highest point, 43% of those testing positive for COVID in the county were Latino. And only 10% of the county's population is Latino. So more than 4 times what we would expect, right? The disproportionate impact is just unbelievable in this community, which is why, again, that the access to information and safety and things like that was so critical. Since that time, the numbers have declined a little bit, but they're still more like still 20 in the low 20s of a percent of those positive cases, right? So still double what we would expect in terms of impacts. We have a lot of agricultural workers, as I mentioned, migrant workers, factory workers, meat packing plants, things like that here in Michigan. People working in the service industry, like the hospitality. We have a lot of hotels in Grand Rapids, restaurants, in the construction field. Like these are all Latino workers, and so much of that work just ground to a halt, right? And again, no safety nets, right? Like they weren't able to apply for unemployment like so many people across the country have been able to. They aren't able to get those additional food benefits, that were implemented in Michigan. If they started having symptoms, they might not have felt comfortable going to seek care, right? And then as things kind of started to open again a little bit, those same barriers not only still existed, but made it more likely that our communities were going to go to work, even if they were sick or had been exposed. People have to eat, right? They have to pay their rent. And so when we talk about the impact of COVID on undocumented communities, I think we can't separate that conversation from these bigger, higher level social issues.
Liana, can you tell us about how your organization has responded to the impact of COVID-19 on the Latinx communities that you serve?
We know that for the Latinx community, family unity is very important, and family unity has been constantly attacked during this administration, particularly during the pandemic. And so for us, it's important that they know that we are a safe place where they can be, that no matter what their immigration status is, they can receive free resources from United for Social Justice. And that if they need additional resources, we're gonna refer them to other nonprofits. Their immigration status shouldn't put them at anguish every day and shouldn't make them scared. And so we provide a safe space for them, regardless of the immigration status, and the quality resources that they need to succeed and function in this society, particularly for the students.
So, Alina, how has your school, DC Bilingual Public Charter School, responded to the impact of COVID-19 on the Latinx families and students that you serve?
Social interaction is really important in the Latina community. And so we thought that it was important to have consistent staff members that will reach out to the same families and that will connect on a personal level with the families, and that will allow our families to open up and share the things that were going on at home so we can support them accordingly. And the other thing was the language piece, right? Ensuring that those connections were made on the preferred language of the family. And that was really successful for us. Many of our families don't have the technology needed at home, or need the education to know how to work with Zoom without like training first. And so something that we did is really use what the community is really good at, that is the phone, the text, to communicate effectively.
So Erika, can you tell us about the ways in which your organizations have responded to the impact of COVID-19 on Latinx communities in the West Michigan area?
As I mentioned, the Grand Rapids Area Mutual Aid Network, Grauman, had already been doing mutual aid. And so by that, I mean collecting cash and just redistributing it back directly to community members who need it. They were also doing grocery deliveries, working with restaurants to get groceries and food donated, things like that. So they were already up and running. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that kind of grassroots mutual aid organizing. That happened outside of systems, right? That happened because neighbors were concerned about their neighbors. And they had, they said, we can't wait for the government or for nonprofits or for philanthropy to really come into this space. It needs to happen now. People are hungry now. So we were able to kind of build on that.
Liana, so what do you see as lessons learned from your work with Latinx youth and immigrants during the pandemic that you think should be taken into account by policymakers, funders, or practitioners working with these communities?
So access to higher education, that has become harder for our students because many of our students are recent arrivals. Imagine recent arrival students learning English and interacting with a teacher from their home online. Maybe some of them do not know how to use a computer, so that has also become a challenge. And access to scholarships has been greatly diminished by this pandemic that has also caused a ripple effect in the funding of many organizations who normally provide scholarships to students. And it has just become a domino effect. People don't have the capacity to, especially our students, to continue producing the high quality work that is demanded from them. Many of our students have shared and asked questions to us. How can I continue having good grades when my parent is going out to work every day and I don't know if we're gonna get the virus, and I don't have really good internet access. And on top of that, I have to share the same room with my several siblings who are also learning online. Mm-hmm. I think that this pandemic has really shown us that it has greatly impacted by far people who are in the working class and low-income families. I think that they are really, really struggling way more than the rest of people in this society. Throughout this time and the years that almost now 2 decades that I have been involved in being an activist in the community, I find a series of problems, whether it be a lawyer who didn't show up to court but still charged the client, a notario who committed fraud in filing paperwork, someone who didn't pay an immigrant for a hard day of work. All of those problems, to me, we can center them with one solution, and that is empowering the community with knowledge about their rights and knowledge about the resources that are available to them. Although undocumented immigrants do not enjoy all of the protections of the United States Constitution, they still have rights. And I think that they ought to know what those rights are, and they can't be bullied by people who are committing fraud and people who want to take advantage of them. They must demand those rights, but it starts with knowledge. And so one of the things that I have committed myself to doing is giving community know your rights presentations, clinics on immigration, so that people don't just go through the motions, but they know where their case stands and what their rights are. And so basically, to summarize, I think that is very important to empower that community with knowledge, not just to go through the motions and help them with the case, but knowledge is powerful. Then they will share it with their family members, and we become more empowered by having knowledge. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's something that we all should work on doing.
Alina, what are some lessons learned from your work with students and families that you think would be important for policymakers, funders, or practitioners working with these communities to consider?
It's also thinking about how schools need to also be learning environments, and not learning environments on the little way of students learning, but also everyone, communities learning, right? And so we need to keep learning about the needs of our families in order to serve them better. And so it's this idea that might be different from the traditional idea of schools that are just students come to school to learn how to behave in society. I think it's a little bit of challenging that idea and thinking of schools as places where students can thrive, being who they are. And so reflecting a lot as a community, as a staff, as leadership of how we are perpetuating or we are dismantling oppression is very important. And then thinking outside of the box all the time, because we have a very close idea of what a school needs to be. And I think that we need to challenge that idea over and over every day in order to really serve the students the way they deserve.
So, Erika, what do you see as important lessons learned from your work with La Lucha Fund that you think should be considered as part of future efforts to improve the well-being of Latinx communities?
Supporting immigration reform work, exactly what you're saying, right? One of the Lucha partners is Movimiento Cosecha. And their long-term goal is dignity, respect, and permanent protection for the 11 million undocumented people living in the United States. Right now, they're working on a driver's license for all campaign. They want to make sure that everyone in Michigan, regardless of their legal status, has the ability to drive legally, right? Because we know that a traffic stop, right, a missed red light or a missed stop sign or a turn signal out, that can be the difference between a family staying together and somebody being put into deportation proceedings and separated from the rest of their family, which in turn can be the difference between that family being financially stable and experiencing homelessness, right? Not being able to feed their kids, not being able to pay the rent. That we understand that immigration reform is connected to economic inequity, is connected to mental health, is connected to physical health, is connected to education, and refuse to talk about it in too simplistic a way, right? To refuse to say that it is only about one thing, because we're not one issue people, right? Like we don't live our lives in a silo, and so we can't pretend that equity in our community is only about one thing. We need to talk about race, right? We need to talk about class. We need to talk about all of these things in conjunction, and we also need to see them as overlapping, right? Like we need to understand that ICE and the immigration detention centers and things like that look a lot like how criminal justice systems work in our Black communities here in the United States, right? We need to think about how people dying in ICE custody look a lot like the systems are very much the same as our Black neighbors and friends and family members dying in police custody.